Welcome to Beer as Remedy and Scapegoat for Illness and Antiquity with Professor and Brewer Travis Rupp. I'm librarian Jana Kopp of the Longmont Public Library, and I'll be hosting tonight's program along with two of my fellow librarians, Josie and Devin. Josie will be taking charge of any technical issues, so if you do experience any issues, you'll find the chat feature in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Feel free to and if you do have any questions to program, feel free to put those in the chat to everyone as well, or to Devin, who will be compiling your questions during this talk for Travis to answer at the end of his presentation. This program was generously funded by the Friends of the Longmont Public Library, and it is my pleasure tonight to introduce Travis, who is a beer archaeologist and holds a position of lecturer in classics, art history, anthropology, and continuing education at the University of Colorado at Boulder, in addition to his work as innovation and wood cellar manager at Avery Brewing here in Boulder, Colorado. And currently 2 of his Ales of Antiquity series are out in cans at Avery, and if you are fortunate enough to get those, like I was, he'll be walking us through some of the tasting notes this evening for the Monticello, which is a persimmon wheat beer based on a recipe from Jefferson's estate, as well as the 1752 India Pale Ale, which is a replica of a beer from that time period. So we do encourage you to relax, sit back, drink your beer if you have some, since we're discussing beer. And we want to let you know that we hope you will keep your microphone on mute and your cameras off, as this program is being recorded. Thank you so much, and I give a warm welcome to Travis Rupp.
Thank you so much, Jan. I really appreciate it, and thanks for the opportunity to do this evening. Fun. So I'm going to go ahead and kick it over here so you guys can see my screen, and we'll get going on the topic. So when the Longmont Library approached me to do this presentation, I was telling them it's kind of it's very much a topic that is of interest for me, but I haven't really worked on it exclusively until as of late. So a lot of what I've done, some of you have probably seen some of my other talks or followed a little bit of my research, know that I do work on beer archaeology, as I call it. So I travel all over the world exploring the history of beer and looking to recreate the past, basically giving something tangible for someone to experience from history. But obviously, in the current situation we're in worldwide with the pandemic, I thought it was of interest to maybe explore a little bit how beer has played a part in antiquity as I say, as a remedy and scapegoat for illness. And I think one of the things that you might find as we move through this evening is that it's more a scapegoat typically than it was an actual cause of illness, especially in major or far ancient times. Now, the topic, as I've been researching it over the last several months, is huge. It's ginormous. And so we can't cover all of history this evening, but I thought for this talk tonight, we'd kind of stay in my wheelhouse of ancient antiquity and kind of work our way up to the present. And maybe there'll be opportunities to talk about more modern history and beer as a remedy or scapegoat down the road. As Jana indicated, I hold a handful of different titles or occupations. And so I am the innovation and wood cellar manager at Avery Brewing Company. So basically my job is to oversee all barrel-aged beers, all barrel-aged products, but also new beer development and brand development. And then I was given a really awesome title, I guess you might say, back in 2016 of beer archaeologist, because I do all of this work collectively as a professor at the university. So I teach classics, art history, and anthropology primarily. And I'll also be starting to teach mechanical engineering for the university this spring, specifically working on beer development and beer design at the University of Colorado Boulder. I've been at Avery for 8.5 years. I've been at the University of Colorado for about 10.5 years. But as I said, most of what I do is kind of this on a daily basis. And when I started the program, I basically lived in my barrel aging cellar, and I was working a lot on barrel aged projects and products. But I was very curious as a historian what beer might have been like in antiquity. And what will be very much telling in the talk this evening is one of the biggest things that I wanted to explore, not really necessarily knowing what the outcome might be, was if beer was any good in antiquity, because a lot of authors have written about the fact that ancient beer probably was not very good, that it was gooey and like porridge-like content, and it was very difficult to palate what was being produced. And of course, these are a lot of assumptions that are being made about ancient beer, and hence a lot of literature that's been written about beer in antiquity indicates that it must have been disgusting or caused illness. But I wanted to kind of explore that. I didn't necessarily know if I believed that. I thought it was a fairly obtuse statement to make. And so I started the Ales of Antiquity program in 2016. And when I started the program, the first beer we made was Nestor's Cup, which was an ancient Mycenaean beer from the Greek Peloponnese. A beer I worked on for almost 3.5 years before we produced it. And I definitely, I think, at least in the world of academia, have worked pretty hard to debunk the idea that the Greeks didn't produce beer, at least Bronze Age Greek peoples. Of course, they weren't unified Greeks yet, but the Bronze Age Aegean was producing beer. And so spending a fair amount of time in Greece and Turkey, we recreated this beer. Shortly thereafter, I did a series for the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Kansu Imheb was an ancient Egyptian beer, which I'll talk a little bit about this evening. Ragnar's Drapa was an ancient Viking ale. It's about 1,000 years old, from Finland. And then Pachamama was an ancient Peruvian beer, also a beer I'll make reference to this evening. A phenomenal opportunity to go live and work with some monks for about a month in Italy, and in Umbria, Italy, at a location called Norcia. And I came back with their yeast, and with the help of Father Martin and the brothers at the monastery, we recreated 2 9th century monastic beers, which I talked about just a couple weeks ago. So if some of you are on in the room tonight that were a part of the gourmet brewing talk I did with Doug Piper a few weeks ago, I talked about those. And then I did some work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, also a beer that I'll allude to this evening. Beer Sheba, references to beer in the biblical tradition. And then as of late, I've been working more and more on coming back home and do a little bit of American historical brewing. And George Washington's Porter started off a kind of a mini series I've done in the last 2 years on resurrecting some of the ales of the Revolution. So George Washington's Porter, which was followed by 1752 India Pale Ale, which I'll talk through the process of creating that beer this evening. And if one of you in the room, or if any of you in the room were lucky enough to get your hands on it, I'm glad to hear it, because we are down to the last few. There are only a couple cases left at the brewery of that beer. I produced that about 10 months ago, and I'll talk more about that later. And then Monticello was the last beer I produced, and it was released in February in homage to Peter Hemmings, the enslaved brewer at Thomas Jefferson's estate. But now enough on the introduction of just kind of what I do. Let's talk a little bit more about what I spend a lot of the rest of my time doing. Of course, I do work extensively on beer, and I am a brewer at Avery Brewing Company, and I work there full time, but I'm also a full-time professor at the University of Colorado, and the vast majority of my work is in the ancient Mediterranean. So I do spend time, up until a few years ago, I spent a lot of my time in Italy and working on Rome, because I'm a Roman archaeologist. But as the project has expanded, I kind of spend my time pretty much everywhere you see on this map from this aerial view of the ancient Mediterranean. More recently, a lot of my time has been spent in the UK, Germany. I'll also be spending some time in Iberia or Spain here coming up soon. But to kick things off tonight, again, this idea, this topic of beer as a remedy or scapegoat for illness in antiquity, I think, again, to harken back to something I said a little bit earlier, always driven me to do the research on the topic is that we too often think that the ancients were dumb and didn't know any better, that because they didn't have the same technology we do, then they didn't know how to create good food or drink, to be honest. Most of the statements that have been made about ancient food are very scathing, and that's usually done by academics who aren't willing to undertake the experimental archaeology to see exactly what this food or alcohol might have looked like or tasted like. But in the ancient Mediterranean, where we're at right now, we're going to start on the right-hand side of the map here and look a little bit at the ancient Near East and Egypt and talk a little bit about the development of beer in the first place. And we really, where we go to is the ancient, what we call the Levant, or it's often referred to also as the Fertile Crescent if it arches or arcs into Egypt. And we're talking about a part of the ancient world that is ancient Mesopotamia, moving through Arabia and Sinai into Egypt as well. And this is basically the area where beer was born, at least in the Western world. The Eastern world's a totally different story to be told. Again, too much content to fit into an hour this evening. But in the Western world, beer was basically born in this area as far as we can tell. And if there is one specific location where beer was born, it was probably somewhere in Syria. So what is modern day Syria in the Levant. And it was a location that was at one point heavily forested, but a major climatic shift occurred probably somewhere between 10,000 and 8,500 BCE that caused mass deforestation of the area, and what came up in its place were wild grasses and cereals. And so the birth of barley and wheat, basically, in a more kind of wild formation or format. But it didn't take that long before we start to see beer being produced for religious activities in the area. This is not to say that they were domesticating grains yet, and honestly, most people were still nomadic. They were still moving around and doing various things in the region. But in Anatolia, in Turkey, what is modern day Turkey, one of the oldest known religious sites that actually exists is a place called Göbekli Tepe. And Göbekli Tepe, which is in southwestern Turkey, is arguably dates all the way back to 9,000 BCE, and you see some of the remains and ruins of it here. Now, though most of what's been studied there is heavily or highly focused on the plinths that you see arranged, these large kind of pilasters, these rectangular formations that exist in the archaeological ruin, most look at that and try to study the religiosity of it and the solar arrangement or the celestial arrangement of the complex. But at the same time, and this is just a reconstruction of what it may have looked like when it was being built or in antiquity, though again, people were still nomadic. They weren't sedentary. They weren't, building nucleated communities yet. They're hunter-gatherers. They took the time to build this religious epicenter, and it was very shortly after it was originally established that we have remains or evidence for beer production. In fact, these beer brewing troughs, you can see them here, made out of limestone. And how we know that they were used for beer is that we can do archaeochemical and archaeobotanical analysis of them and figure out exactly what was in them, what organic materials once existed in there. As it says on the slide here, oxalates from grain converted to alcohol were found, meaning that they were brewing. And this is putting beer, at least some 10,000 years ago, if we're correct in our dating system, which throws a whole bunch of questions at beer production and domestication in general, because most people up until really the last couple of decades thought that beer probably didn't come about till maybe 5,000 BCE, and domestication of crops and animals didn't occur till that time as well. Well, this is predating that by a pretty fair mark. And it also shows that grain was being cultivated for beer, not bread, in these early facets. So clearly beer is not seen as an illness-causing item at this point. As a matter of fact, what it was probably being used for, though it is being highly focused on and used in mass production at this religious construct, it was probably being used for religious activity, undoubtedly. Beer and the fact that you can add some grain to water, let it sit out and yeast ferments it was probably considered quite divine. Louis Pasteur won't figure out what yeast is for honestly thousands of years from this point, so they didn't actually know exactly what was causing the fermentation, but they did know what the product they were consuming caused some effects that were pleasing. Obviously, a little bit of alcohol, happy and buzzed at times, right? But ancient alcohol was probably not that potent. Likely, we're dealing with alcohol. We're dealing with beer with probably an alcohol content of maybe 1 to 2%. But at the same time, they were doing it. One theory is that they would have known that beer was more, or I should say, was safer to drink than water. A lot of water sources were full of microbial activity and things that cause disease and ailments. Just a little bit of alcohol, actually less than 1% alcohol by volume, will kill almost 99% of bacteria in water. And so they were consuming beer as a means to sustain themselves and also as a means to kind of remedy an issue where water, again, was not safe to drink at various times throughout antiquity. Now we jump ahead a little bit. Of course, this is a really old site from 9,000, 9,500 or so BCE. But if we jump ahead to better known instances in antiquity that reference beer, and this is one of my favorites. Some of you who have seen some of my other talks know I love to give this quote, but it's near and dear to my heart because it references beer. And one of the most famous epics from antiquity is the Epic of Gilgamesh, of course, a retelling or an alternate telling or a parallel telling of the flood story from biblical antiquity. But in this one recount of beer, I just love it, and I'll read it very much in brief. Enkidu, a shaggy, unkempt, almost bestial primitive man who ate grass and could milk wild animals, wanted to test his strength against Gilgamesh, the demigod-like sovereign. Taking no chances, Gilgamesh sent a prostitute to Enkidu to learn of his strengths and weaknesses. Enkidu enjoyed a week with her, during which she taught him of civilization. Enkidu knew not what bread was, nor how one ate it. He had also not learned to drink beer. The prostitute opened her mouth and spoke to Enkidu, "Eat the bread now, O Enkidu, as it belongs to life. Drink also beer, as it is the custom of the land." Enkidu drank 7 cups of beer, and his heart soared. Mine would as well. In this condition, he washed himself and became a human being. And what I love about this quote in regards to the topic we're exploring this evening is clearly, even in the Epic of Gilgamesh, to drink beer, to consume beer, is to make one human. It's literally what makes us human. It's what turns him into a human being. And it is not a product of illness, or I should say it is not something that, it is not a cause or catalyst of illness. It is literally what turns him into a human being. And as a side note with that, something I'll be exploring a bit more here in just a bit, if you look at the biblical tradition, though the Tanakh, of the Jewish tradition, or the Christians refer to this as the Old Testament, the barley itself is referenced multiple times, and oftentimes not just as a food consumable, but sometimes in a porridge-like state or as a liquid. And it's referenced as having been beneficial, that it was not an ailment. 25 times, actually, in the Tanakh, this is referenced, or the Old Testament of the Christian tradition. Now, staying in a chronological arrangement with this time, if we move forward to Egypt, and here we're looking at the Valley of the Kings in ancient Egypt. This seems to have also been the case for those peoples. It seems to have reigned supreme, because here you see it from an aerial view, the arrangement of the Valley of the Kings. But if we are to look at the vast majority of the tombs that are there, and of course there are dozens upon dozens, the vast majority that are listed on this map are royal tombs, but there were a lot of subsidiary tombs that were affiliated with aristocrats or individuals that worked for royalty in ancient Egypt. And it actually wasn't all that long ago, only just a couple years back in 2014, a new tomb was opened, which was the tomb of the brewer, the tomb of an individual named Khonsu Imheb. And you'll remember I referenced his name earlier because it was, in fact, this gentleman that inspired my recreation of an ale from Egypt that dates back to approximately 1800 or so BCE. But in ancient Egypt, beer also was not seen as a causer for ailment. In fact, it was considered one of the most appropriate and the best commodities to deliver to divinities as well as kings. This individual in particular, Khonsu Imheb, was actually the royal brewer for Amenhotep III, who, if we're correct in the chronology and actually if there was an actual blood lineage at the time, would have been the grandfather of King Tut or King Tutankhamun. And so really interesting to see how heavily affiliated, again, beer is with royalty. I mean, we think back to ancient antiquity and we think or we presume that these kind of people would have never been drinking beer. They're too esteemed. At least that's what the Greeks and Romans give us in some of their literature, a topic here I'll explore in just a moment. But the ancient Egyptians held beer in very, very high regard, so much so that from one tomb to the next, you would find these. These are little models that would be placed inside tombs. Later, they'll be referred to as shabtis as well. And these little statues that were placed in these model-esque forms, the Egyptians thought they would come to life. If you placed them inside of the tomb, they would be there when you transgressed to the afterlife. They were stand-ins for the living things. So the more human figures, vessels, whatever it might be you put in your tomb, the more things you would have in the afterlife. And it was very common, especially starting in the Middle Kingdom, to see a lot of breweries and bakeries rebuilt in these little model formations and placed in tombs. And we see them here actually producing beer, which is just a phenomenal find. And again, we find it over and over and over again. In regards to it literally as a remedy, though, if we think about medicine from ancient Egypt, again, it's a peoples that are really, really old, right? I mean, we're talking about going back 4,000 years plus, and we can't at all presume that they had any kind of formalized medicine, but that is not true. In fact, they actually had very formalized medicine, so much so that ancient Egyptians had dentists, surgeons, gynecologists, veterinarians, all of that kind of stuff that was already built into their sociological makeup. And we find all of this stuff in royal tomb paintings. For the example, on the right-hand side, we actually see scenes of circumcision that were clearly laid out, and it shows that circumcision occurred as a rite of passage into adulthood when boys were a little bit older. And beer was a drug, if you wanted to call it that. I mean, for whatever ailment you might be experiencing, this is a list of well-known remedies for ailments: water, milk, honey, wine, beer, depending on what you were experiencing. Blood, fat, bones, organs. Mice, yes. Little dormice or field mice were consumed, and in some instances, they were consumed whole and alive in order to cure various ailments. Herbal medicine, opium, and cannabis as well. Obviously, with cannabis, you got to take that with a little bit of a caveat, because the cannabis plant, marijuana, that we're more familiar with, especially in Colorado, is a New World plant. There is a derivative of it, or a relative, it seems, or a similar genus that may have existed in the ancient world that they were smoking as well. Opium was widely consumed during this time. But of course, they were learning their trade, because the same people that were conducting medicine were also the embalmers. These were the guys that were carrying out a lot of the mummification, so they could learn a lot about the body. But again, back to our topic, beer was one of the drugs to remedy a vast majority of ailments. Jumping to the biblical era, and jumping to a topic that probably is not something you would ever really affiliate with beer, but a topic I did a lot of research on a couple of years ago when the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit came in to DMNS. The Denver Museum of Nature and Science reached out to me and asked me to do some work on alcohol as it was related in the biblical tradition, but also as it is referenced in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I worked pretty extensively on the topic, looking at, in particular, the Roman era of ancient Israel, looking at Jerusalem in particular, and trying to find relevant references during the Jewish revolts, that is the Jewish revolts against the Romans from 66 to 73, that eventually the Emperor Titus put to bed, and did explore a lot of the archaeological record as well in ancient Jerusalem, specifically looking at the Temple on the Mount, which of course the Romans destroyed, and in their audacity, not only did they destroy it, tear it to the ground, but they built a Roman temple to the imperial cult right next to it. as a very distinct statement of Rome was here, and this idea of a monotheistic tradition needed to be put to bed and laid to bed. But of course, we know that it was not. It did not get put to bed or laid to bed. Both Judaism and Christianity have thrived since then. And so really the question became, what exists in the ancient biblical record that might indicate that there was any kind of beer production? And if there was beer production, what was it being used for? Well, there is no word in Hebrew, or at least in the Hebrew tradition as it's explored in the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Bible, that references beer. For example, this is the Hodiat scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It talks about production of various things in the region. But remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found on the Dead Sea, right? An area that's completely arid and should not be producing any kind of foliage for the development of grains or crops. And it says, "You have set me at the source of streams in a dry land, at the spring of water in a parched land, in a garden watered by channels hidden among all the trees, which shall make a shoot grow in the everlasting plantation," giving this indication that the ability, to me, this gave the indication the ability to produce beer must have been very, very scant, if almost impossible. Later references, even from more modern research and scholarship, this is from Bruce Filer's work, Walking the Bible, if you're familiar with the book. He says, "We stepped out of the car at the southern tip of the Dead Sea into a mixture of sulfurous air, oppressive heat, and deceptively inviting turquoise waters. The climate here is like an anti-greenhouse, with all the moisture sucked out of the air." And this gives the indication, again, that beer, there's no way beer could have been produced here. The biblical tradition must indicate that beer was bad, that it was not being produced, that it is not possible. Yet, when you look at sources that are contemporaneous to the Jewish revolts against the Romans, Pliny the Elder, in his natural histories, he says, "On the west side of the Dead Sea is the solitary tribe of the Essene, which is remarkable beyond all other tribes, and has only palm trees for company." And digging into the record and digging into what actually appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls and what could have been grown there. I mean, these ancient peoples were very prolific in their irrigation systems and water catchment, but there is a reference to something called shikar. And shikar, as I've worked with some professors at Gonzaga, trying to figure out what this term meant, because I myself, though I know Latin and Greek, do not know Hebrew. And I was asking them exactly what this term meant. And they pointed me in some various directions, but they said, well, it seems to be some kind of derivative of wine. And if it's a derivative of wine, then we would presume that's 100% grape-based, but in fact, it's not. As it says in Numbers 6:3, you can see it in the Hebrew above, but below, "The Nazir shall abstain from wine and shikar. He shall not drink vinegar of wine or of shikar, neither shall he drink anything in which grapes have been steeped," in which grapes have been steeped. And that's the critical piece of it. The ancient Israelis were, in fact, producing beer. We actually know they produced a large quantity of beer, but what I believe is going on here is they were using grapes as a starter for their yeast to produce beer. They were steeping the grapes in the beer in order to produce a barley or cereal-based beverage, which is why the Nazir are not allowed to drink it. It's considered unholy by some accounts. And it's probably a direct correlative of an older Akkadian drink we know as shikru or shikaru, which was probably beer. And so even the ancient, though the ancient biblical tradition was producing it, it's hidden, it's masked in the record. And why? Well, maybe because they saw it as a scapegoat. This is an instance where specific people are not allowed. They must abstain from consuming it, because it's impure. And this is a motif or a trend I'll explore a little bit more in our remaining time here this evening, is this idea that beer is impure, therefore a scapegoat for illness, whereas wine is pure, it will not cause illness. And potentially, just as an explanation for this, if there is any validity to the idea that beer caused illness, and when you buy your six-pack of your favorite beer, if you go out and buy a six-pack of Avery IPA, for example, or Ales Brown or White Rascal, any of these beers that we produce, you'll notice they all look very different. Now, Ales Brown, IPA, these more traditional styles, they're very clear. And that's because we've filtered out the vast majority of the yeast. White Rascal has a lot of yeast still in suspension, but it's not at such a high content that it will make you sick. And yes, if you consume an alcoholic beverage that has a lot of yeast in suspension, it will make you sick. For example, I love hazy IPAs. I'm a big fan of Weld Works here in Colorado, or Cerebral. I'm sure some of you are familiar. But man, if I drink 4 or 5 of those beers in one sitting, I am going to have the worst headache tomorrow morning, if that's the case. And it's because consuming a lot of dead yeast cells actually causes hangovers. It will make you, quote, sick. Now, the ancients had a remedy for this, though. What you see here, this is what we call a sieve jar. And the idea was that you pour the beer in the top, and then the lip at the bottom, you drink it out of the lip. And the idea was that that little perforated sieve would catch the large particulate and prevent you from consuming something that would, quote, make you sick. These were also found in one of the most tombs from ancient Turkey in the Gordian archaeological site, or from the Gordian kingdom of the tomb of Midas. In King Midas's tomb, these sieve jars were found as well. So we know that they knew this, and they were trying to filter out the stuff that could make you, quote, sick. Now, from the Greek tradition, the same is true. If we bounce off finally, we're moving to the far right-hand side of the map, Turkey, Israel, Egypt, and we're starting to move into the Mediterranean. One of the things, as I said at the very beginning, that I wanted to debunk with this series and this project was the idea that the ancient Greeks and Romans didn't consume beer. And a lot of the evidence for this pointed to Crete. Now, one of the reasons why a lot of individuals thought that the Greeks didn't consume beer was they don't write about it very much. And if they do, they have a lot of bad things to say about it. And they're like, well, if they didn't like it or if it made them sick, well, why would they have consumed it? But I don't think that's the case. The island of Crete yielded a lot of information for me. It's a jumping off point. A lot of ideas are coming from the Near East, then being distributed into the rest of the Mediterranean. Here, the island of Crete from an aerial perspective, so the volcanic island blew itself apart somewhere between 1450 and 1350 BCE. But spending a fair amount of time there, my wife and I was doing a lot of research, and we were traveling, and more motifs kept popping up for beer and barley production in a place, honestly, that was probably not conducive to cereal production. As a matter of fact, when you look at the island of Santorini, we know it better as now, or Thera, this is what it looks like. It's extremely arid, and it's primarily occupied by vines. These are actually grapevines, and this is how they grow on the island. Isn't that cool? They basically circle in on themselves. They try to basically hoard any moisture in one spot, so they twirl in on themselves naturally like this. But no cereals, because this is what the topography looks like. Is it possible, as I postulated, you saw that jug I showed you earlier, that barley fronds on it, that maybe, just maybe, the Greeks thought, at least in the Bronze Age Aegean, shouldn't call them Greeks yet, but the Bronze Age Aegean, that maybe cereals were more important than the grapes because it was harder to get. Now, we would expect to find references to beer then in our well-known literary sources, Homer, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. There's got to be references in there, right? Our first known written Greek for study, are there references to beer? Well, in fact, there are references that could be considered beer. For example, in the Iliad, in book 11, there are references to something called koukeon. See it there in its Greek spelling. And koukeon, according to Homer, was something that Hecamede developed, and she gave it to Nestor and Machaon in order to basically dupe them into something. She basically was trying to seduce them, get them drunk, and manipulate them. In the Odyssey, it's referenced multiple times as well. Circe makes koukeon for Odysseus and his men. It was magical potion, and supposedly it was some kind of concoction of wine, cheese, onions, honey, and barley meal. Boy, doesn't that sound like a really, really tasty beer. I think not. But koukeon is something that's referenced, and according to our modern standards, if it has cereals in it, which it does, it has barley, then it's a beer. But it's meant to be a magical potion. It's meant to cause some kind of intoxication. And also, same time, though, does that mean that beer was considered bad by the Greeks? No. I mean, a lot of people look at Homer and say if kukeon is in fact a beer, then it was a cause of illness, and that's why they just never talk about it. Well, in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, in the lines you see here in Greek, actually what it's saying in English translation is basically that Metanaira, the woman who's kneeling on the right-hand side, she's bringing an offering to the goddess Demeter, and she brings wine, and Demeter immediately says, no, I will not take that. Bring me the mixture of barley and water. And that's her choice. That's her consumable choice. Now, it doesn't necessarily say that it was fermented, but it is barley and water, which is basically the grounds or the specific ingredients to make beer. Kukeon was also used in what we call the Eleusinian Mysteries, which was a place where people got rip-roaring drunk and high, basically, in order to carry out various mystery festivals for deities in ancient Greece. And Demeter is actually considered the barley mother. But when we think about what beer must have been in ancient Greece, we look at it in a very negative light or a very negative way. For example, Euripides, extremely well-known Greek tragedian, he says that if one doesn't drink wine, they drink water. He also goes on to say in a fragment 892 at the bottom, that the comestibles of cereal and water are satisfactory to no one, almost indicating that beer causes sickness, illness, or is unpleasing. Yet at the same time, the Greeks had no druthers from consuming large and copious amounts of drugs or psychedelics. For example, at the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, we actually know the oracle there, we presume the oracle anyway, was huffing noxious gases that were coming out of the mountainside in order to extend her blather of nonsensical dialogue to various individuals who will come seeking guidance from the oracle. The same is true at Eleusis. Eleusis is just outside of Athens, and at Eleusis, again, we actually know that they were consuming not only alcohol, but edibles for their various psychedelic features and facets in order to have this otherworldly experience. And so alcohol here is not really, it's not necessarily a remedy, but it's also not necessarily the scapegoat for illness. It actually allows you to transgress or transition to a different elemental position in the cosmos, if you will. Finally, to the Roman era, the Romans are a topic that I've explored most extensively because my current project is on Roman Britain. But again, as a Roman archaeologist, I've spent a large portion of my time exploring what food and alcohol looked like in ancient Rome. And in the Roman Empire, this is the world of wine. This is the world of the grape. And pretty much anything we hear referenced is going to reference the superiority of wine. But as some of you have heard me say before, and I'll say it again, we can't, you can only imagine, I mean, just think about it. We're talking about a peoples who probably only 1% of the population was literate. Of that 1% of the population, we have a minor fragment of texts that still remain for our study. Just imagine if we left it up to the upper 1% of our population to write all our history, right? And if we did that, we are not going to hear much about some of the things that we all enjoy that are in this room this evening, because it would be a completely skewed perspective of history. Well, that's what we get from ancient Rome in the literary tradition. Now, luckily, Pliny the Elder, I referenced him before, but this man, I consider him completely, he's just so valuable to the study, and he is certainly a favorite of mine. But Pliny the Elder, even though he might scoff at alcohol, or I shouldn't say alcohol, he scoffs at beer. He loves wine, but scoffs at beer. He at least tells me about it. He at least tells us what it could have been like. In the first line, Estet Occidentes, populus sua abriatas fruge medida pluribus modis per Gallias Hispaniasque, and so on and so forth. He basically goes on to tell us that the Gauls and the people of Iberia and the Aegyptos, the Egyptians, all of these individuals produced beer. And it created a particular intoxication. He doesn't necessarily damn it. He also goes on to tell us of locations throughout the world that were major producers of beer. And again, these are the three that he highlights: Gaul, Spain, and Egypt. Now, what did they do with the beer? Well, he says, lactis potus ossa alet frugum nervos aqua carnes. What's hilarious about this is he says that basically milk is good for your skin. Beer or things that come from cereals are good for your sinew, like your nerves or even potentially just your ligaments. And then he says water is good for the muscles. But in the last quote, the bottom quote, spuma, as he references it, he says that the only thing that's beneficial about beer is kreuzen. Now, kreuzen is basically, have you ever seen a homebrewer's bucket and they pop the lid off? It's that brown, gray, nasty stuff that's at the top of the bucket. He says that the only thing that's good about that is women collect it and they rub it on their face, and it's good for their skin. And it's basically yeast poop. That's what it is. It's a byproduct of fermentation. And so this is what Pliny says beer is good for. He says it's not really good for anything else. Other scholars, or I should say other historians from ancient Rome, mimic this. The Britons, as Strabo says, a travel author from ancient Rome, are more primitive and more barbaric than the Gauls. They create, quote, the barbarian's beverage. But I think that's a little unfair. Again, beer being used as a scapegoat, beer being used as a marker for being a barbarian, a non-Roman. The reason beer was so widely consumed in places like Britain, Gaul, Spain, is that grapes don't grow that well there. They don't grow nearly as well as they do in certain places of Lower Iberia. Of course, that's a good grape growing production, but we don't think that actually happened until the Romans arrived. Italy, so on and so forth. Look at Britain. I mean, in the scale of percentage of grape production in each area, Britain produces almost nothing. To continue that idea of what beer is perceived as doing or being in antiquity, Pliny the Elder in his Natural Histories, he goes on to say that beer basically had a shelf life, and he was shocked. He says that certain places of Gaul and Spain could produce beer in the provinces that actually, as it says at the bottom, will bear being kept a long time, almost indicating that they knew that beer could spoil, or wine didn't necessarily do that. And again, of course, you consume spoiled beer, you might not be the happiest. It might make you sick. Diodorus Siculus also mimics this idea, but he says that beer is, again, a scapegoat. He talks about barley, a barley drink which they call zythos, and they drink the water with which they cleanse their honeycombs, basically that they're making mead. And he says that these Gauls are addicted to wine because of its high alcohol content. If they drink a bunch of it, they basically go into a huge frenzy and they get drunk and they fall into a stupor or state of madness. And again, it's a scapegoat for their causes. Consequently, and just comedically, Diodorus Siculus later goes on to say that's why people have mustaches. He actually says that the reason why some of the ancient peoples in various regions donned mustaches was to filter out the yeast that I talked about earlier, because they didn't want to consume that bit because it would make them sick. Dioscorides, in his medical documents in the De Materia Medica, he actually says that cormy, made from barley and often drunk instead of wine, produces headaches. It's a compound of bad juices and does harm to muscles. And basically giving the indication you shouldn't drink it, it's bad for you, right? And this is mimicked even in the overall economics of ancient Rome, where there are certain beers that were considered more valuable than others, that you had to pay more money for various beers than others because some they thought were spoiled bad by the time they got there. Yet they had all kinds of different terms for the various beers, and they basically were stylizing beers. But when it comes to the Romans, though they like to bash it, though Pliny likes to talk down on beer, the Romans drank a lot of it. And my most recent project, which this will end up being the next Ales of Antiquity, working in Roman Britain on Hadrian's Wall, indicates that they consumed a tremendous amount of beer. The Roman military, they're not of that upper 1% of the population, so they were requesting brewers all the time. For example, here you see the remains of Vindolanda, one of the best preserved Roman military camps in the Roman world. And what's so wonderful about the location is a lot of items that would most often be decomposed are well preserved in the boggy soil there. And this tablet from Vindolanda 182, it references a bunch of essentially rations that they are looking to procure for the Roman troops, but it also references this. I love this. Atrectus the brewer, Atrectus the Cervasarius, and that he makes the good stuff. And they actually go on later in other documents to say we need more brewers like that guy, that he's what's keeping the esteem high for the Roman troops. And brewers and beer and those rations are what keep us going. It keeps us fighting the wars for you elites. Now, why does it get to the point where it is today? And this will be kind of my conclusory wrap up, and then I'll talk about the two Ales of Antiquity very briefly. Is that when we think about what happens to Rome, remember that in the 4th century CE, Constantine will convert the Roman world to a Christian institution. Now, when he did that, as this map shows, there weren't that many Christians in the world. As a matter of fact, we presume that it may have been less than 10% of the overall population of the Mediterranean and Europe were Christian when Constantine won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312, and then later goes on to convert Rome to an institution of Christianity. Even to the degree that if you think that Rome is dead and gone, well, a lot of their institutionalization is very much alive and well in the Roman Catholic Church and the Vatican. But that's a topic for a different story in a different time. But the damnation of beer really starts around that time. With the rise of Christianity, they were working very hard to distinguish themselves from the barbaric other. And one of the ways they did that was by damning beer. Eusebius, who wrote the hagiography or the saintly biography of Constantine, says that he, that is Isaiah, says that all the makers, not of the wine from the vine, but of the Egyptian Zuthos, will groan. And Zuthos was Egyptian beer. Zuthos was adulterated and made cloudy. The Egyptians used it as a drink before the Lord lived among them. Other indications, and again, this is, of course, the tradition that's being carried forward because Christianity is spreading, and it spreads and percolates into these areas from about 312 or so, especially by 337 when Constantine dies, all the way up to 600. Later well-known saints would carry this same tradition or idea forward. For example, the very, very famous Saint Jerome, he goes on to talk about Egyptian beer. And he almost seems to simply correct a mistranslation about Egyptian brewing, almost as though he's defending Egypt, but it's also because he was from an area that produced beer. He was native to Dalmatia, and he would have known Sabaeum, which was a beer. He probably drank it himself when he was a youth or even maybe in his adulthood. St. Cyril, or I should say, let's talk about Isidore. First, Isidore of Seville in Spain also suggests that beer is to be found in his partibus Hispaniae, quis ferex vini locus non est, in those parts of Hispania not fertile in wine or vines. So he's basically explaining away why people might consume beer in areas where vines don't grow. But at the same time, you move to someone like Cyril, who in his writings almost mimics Psalm 104:15, which basically, if you jump to my last bullet point, indicates that drinking wine over beer was a symbol of Christian conversion. And that brings us up to actually the very reason why we still have beer, though. The very institution that sought to damn it, degrade it, make it a scapegoat for illness and non-belief was the very same institution that saved it. St. Bridget of Kildare or Kildare, a female saint who was a follower of St. Patrick, obviously being in Ireland, was in a location that could not mass produce wine. So she made the decision to serve beer on Easter. She was mixing pagan, Celtic, and Christian virtues, and beer becomes a medicine under her. She was credited for having turned water into beer as opposed to water into wine. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, St. Bridget, as it just came up in the chat. And she also had a red beer that I'm trying to figure out exactly what this was, because red beer supposedly she gave out as a remedy for leprosy and supposedly thought it was a cure for leprosy. And this would be carried on later into the monastic tradition. I mean, if we look at one of the oldest monastery maps that we have from the monastery of St. Galen in Switzerland, breweries were one and the same. They were mainstays of monasteries, and they were widely consuming beer, and beer was for everyone. It could be for the higher affluent levels of society like Celia, cerveza for the brothers to drink throughout the day, while they were working, and then the conventus as something to give out to the public. Now, as I said at the beginning, this is way too big of a topic to pack into this one 45-minute to an hour presentation I have, but I thought a little fun anecdote to jump way, way ahead and talk about how beer is a scapegoat for a lot of periods throughout history. I thought it was appropriate since we're in October and Halloween's right around the corner. Is witches, for example, are a product. The tradition of witchcraft and witches is a product of misnomers against alewives. As a matter of fact, in the 15th and 16th centuries, in England in particular, but it did spread to other regions throughout the world. It also made its way over to the early colonies of the once to be or originally or eventually named United States. That alewives, because it was women primarily that were brewing beer, the alewives who would wear pointy hats to demarcate that they had fresh brew inside, or by some accounts, would put a broom outside, although this has been discredited by some historians. They think it might have just been a stick that was put up outside as a marker that there was fresh beer inside. In the 15th and 16th centuries, they started to be targeted as mixing potions into their cauldrons. Boy, doesn't this sound familiar. And these were just mash tuns. They were producing beer in them. Or that they were doing various things and creating potions that would dupe the populace. And this went on to the degree that we now have in our legends and mythology the story of the witch, which is completely falsified and completely misinterpreted because beer was a scapegoat for ailments, illness, and dupery in antiquity. And I just love that. I think it's so interesting from a historical perspective that witches that we affiliate with Halloween, they were brewers. They were brewsters in particular in England. And this idea that they put a broom out or wear a hat to indicate they have fresh brew, there's nothing odd about that. As a matter of fact, I've worked on ancient Peruvian beers, and they still do it today. This is clearly this dog drank way too much chicha, but you can see the staff that's hanging out, the red marker on it that indicates there's fresh beer. Come on by, and you can get some fresh beer at these locations. There's nothing odd or strange about that. So lastly, if you did have the opportunity to pick up some of a couple of my Ales of Antiquity, I do have the 1752 India Pale Ale that's almost out. I also have, which Jana shared at the beginning, so you can get that in cans. Also Monticello, which came out this year. In regards to 1752, also just to the topic of ailments and the idea of sickness, again, as I started this conversation off with, I think too often from a modern perspective, we think ancient beer was bad. And this was exactly why I did this beer. 1752 India Pale Ale was an attempt to recreate the IPA in its original form. When it was originally produced in London or in England and shipped to India. Now, by most modern perspectives, it must have been terrible. It must have been disgusting. And therefore, I wanted to see if it was. And yes, at 7% alcohol, the reason it was 7%, we actually presume that some of the IPAs, the original IPAs, were even higher than that potentially because they were trying to make them shippable. They were trying to basically increase the alcohol content if they could in order to ensure it wouldn't spoil on the journey. But when we recreated this beer, we did everything to it. We brewed it in our brew house, obviously, but I put it through the ringer. I fermented it in oak. This is Colin Quinn, one of my colleagues, and I barreling it. We fermented it in oak just like they did. We left headspace to try to abuse the beer, make it oxidize and get bad, basically, which is what most scholars had presumed it would do. And this is my colleague, Andy Parkey, you got to love it. He's imitating what the yeast is doing in those barrels, just cranking it along, getting it up to that 7% alcohol range, which I didn't know if it would get up there, but it did. It got up to that 7% mark. You can see it gurgling away on the left-hand side there. And then we also dry hopped it, put even more hops in it, and in the oak, in the barrel itself. And we kept moving it around. We would fluctuate the temperatures because this thing had a long journey from England to India. It had to be on choppy water, so we'd shake the barrels every day to abuse the beer, literally. And then again, on a very regimented schedule that would mimic an actual trip from London to India, I would move it back and forth into various climate zones. Here I'm moving it into a zone where it's approximately about 38 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit about the coldest it would get as they went around the Cape of Good Hope. Again, just trying to make the beer, if you will, bad. And honestly, when we debarreled it and we filtered it the same way they did. They actually used flannel to filter it. I assure you, I did not use my flannel shirts because I didn't think you wanted to taste Axe deodorant in the beer or something like that. Then it got packaged and put out, and I'll be damned if it's not quite tasty. And I'll cheers to that because I didn't think it was going to be. We literally tried to abuse the living hell out of it. And here it is now, an aged IPA. People don't do that. Don't age IPAs. That's my little tag on that. IPA should be consumed fresh, but this one is now almost about 10 months old. And we know actually a lot of the IPAs, when they get to India, they might sit in warehouses for an additional 2 years before they were consumed. And it's pretty damn good. It's still really quite palatable. It is not, it doesn't taste oxidized. It tastes kind of oaky. It's really quite surprising, and it's changed over the course of its life in these 10 months. Here are just some of the flavor notes. A little oak. You get a little bit earthy, some banana, vanilla in there, a little hoppy as well. A little spicy also from the yeast. The other beer, Monticello, which I have not opened yet. I'll go ahead and open it. I'll just say this quickly because I know I'm pretty much out of time. Monticello I made, and though this doesn't really necessarily apply to tonight's topic, I highly encourage you to grab some if you're curious. Again, I really wanted to pay homage to Peter Hemmings, who was an enslaved brewer at Monticello. I did not call this beer Thomas Jefferson's beer because Thomas Jefferson didn't brew it, to be honest. An enslaved African-American individual was responsible for brewing the vast majority of beer at Monticello. And so we recreated a recipe that I found in the archives at Thomas Jefferson's estate when I was doing research there a couple of years ago from 1822. And it is a persimmon wheat ale that they literally would recreate a beer that was basically based off persimmon bread. It's actually really fun, man. I actually haven't drank one in a couple months, and it really, really turned out nice. And it's pretty beefy. Coming at 8.5%, it was one of their strong ales for the time. It's one of the stronger beers that they could produce. As I said at the beginning then, if you're curious what I'll be doing, the pandemic has stifled a little bit of my production as of late, but Roman Britain will be the next Ale of Antiquity, hopefully coming out this year, if not this year, early next year. And I have 3 other projects on deck for 2021 in hopes that the pandemic releases. One's another revolutionary ale, another one in the UK, and then I'll be doing a project in Sweden. And then if you're curious at any point of what I'm doing, you can follow me at these various locations. The best place to follow me is on Instagram or on my Facebook page, but I'm most active on Instagram because, let's be honest, Instagram's real easy. And that's all I got for you guys tonight. Thanks for joining me, and I'll take any questions you guys have right now.
Hi, guys. I'm Devin. I'm a librarian at the Longmont Library, and we don't have very much time, but we're going to hope to get through these questions. Kind of already answered this one, Travis, but was beer maybe considered low class or used by inferior people?
Great question. Yeah, for the most part, it seems that that's the case, that it was affiliated with the non-elite, and therefore we have very little literature written about it. But yes, that does seem to be the case.
Okay. Is there any documentation of pregnant women drinking and indications of fetal alcohol syndrome?
Ooh, wow, that is a really good question. Not one I've ever received before, to be honest. No documentation that I have ever encountered. I would presume that it was unlikely for the vast majority of the history I explored this evening, only because most brew from that ancient period did not really exceed the 2.5% ABV mark. So it was really quite low. But that's a really good question. That's something I have to look into a little bit more. I'm not familiar with any indications of that, though.
Okay. When you recreate ancient beers, how do you go about determining the ingredients? Do you mostly rely on text, or do you use any kind of chemical analysis of ancient cups or vessels?
Yes, so both. So a lot of my research starts with the literary, but then I travel to the locations that I'm working on, and also dig into the archaeochemical and archaeobotanical record. And so I use both the science and the literature to recreate these beers. Of course, when it comes down to the final decision to write the recipe, there are times where I've had to take a bit of artistic license, but I always try to err on the side of what I think anthropologically and even just climatically would have been available at the time. But I do use both science and literature to recreate them.
Okay, great. What do you choose to modify about ancient ale recipes to make it palatable for today's consumer, and to what justification or limit?
Sure. So in the very beginning, I used to blend yeasts in order to make it a bit more palatable, as opposed to relying on wild elements to ferment what I'm producing. I don't do that anymore. So for the last probably 5 or 6 Ales of Antiquity, I'm letting history do its own work. And because the Ales of Antiquity series has gotten enough traction and interest, I have that backing from Avery that, hey, if it doesn't turn out very, very palatable, at least people will get to experience some history. But I'm not being forced to create something that is, quote, good. You know what I mean? They want me to recreate history to the best of my ability. Obviously, nobody can ever fully recreate exactly what these were, but I get as close as I darn well can.
That's really neat. We're looking forward to your upcoming beers.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Well, it is 8 o'clock, everybody. We appreciate everybody showing up. This has been a great program. And thank you, Travis. Always interesting and great to have you. And for anybody that experienced any technical difficulties, we are recording this and it will be on our YouTube channel. So we plan on doing more of these virtual programs. So check out our calendar to make sure you are signed up for them. And thanks again, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Devin.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.